In the last week of January 1916, Hannah Peck came to New York to visit her daughter and to be cared for in her final illness by the most attentive son-in-law a mother could have asked for. She was 61 years old, and she had raised her family in Grand Rapids, Michigan, in the particular comfort that came from marrying well and living carefully. Her husband, John Edward Peck, had built one of the great pharmaceutical fortunes of the Midwest, a business worth millions, and Hannah had spent the second half of her life inside that comfort, the wife of a respected man, the mother of a married daughter who now lived in a fine apartment on Riverside Drive in Manhattan with a husband everyone agreed was a rising young professional. Hannah Carpenter had been born in 1854, and by the time she married John Peck, she had already lived through the ordinary uncertainties of a 19th century Michigan girlhood, a childhood, without the guarantee of the comfort that would come later. Whatever she was as a young woman, she became, across 4 decades of marriage, a fixture of Grand Rapids respectability, the kind of woman whose name appeared beside her husband's on the donor lists of local churches and hospitals, whose household ran with the quiet competence of someone who had learned early that comfort has to be tended rather than simply enjoyed. She had one daughter she adored, Clara, and when Clara married a promising young dentist and moved to New York, Hannah did what mothers of means and devotion did in that era. She visited, she fussed, she worried, in the ordinary, unremarkable way any mother worries about a daughter 3 states and 400 miles from home, and she looked forward to those visits as one of the genuine pleasures left to her in a life that had otherwise settled into a comfortable, uneventful rhythm. Hannah Peck was not a woman who expected to be in danger in her own daughter's home. She had come to New York a little unwell, nothing alarming. The ordinary complaints of a woman past 60, and her son-in-law, a dentist by training and by every outward sign a devoted and solicitous young man, had taken personal charge of her care. He brought her capsules. He mixed her tonics himself, standing at her bedside with the calm competence of a medical man, measuring, stirring, presenting the glass with a steady and reassuring hand. She trusted him completely. He had married her daughter. He called her mother. Every dose he gave her was a lie with a needle at the end of it. And I want you to hold that image for a moment before we go any further. A 61-year-old woman lying in bed in her own daughter's home, growing weaker by the day, being nursed with total devotion by the one person in that apartment who was, in fact, the only danger in the room. Tonight, we revisit one case that unfolded almost entirely behind the closed door of a sick room, in full view of a loving family who never once suspected that the hand bringing the medicine was the hand causing the disease. One family immensely wealthy and entirely unsuspecting. One son-in-law who treated murder as a scientific problem to be solved by trial and error, and one investigation that very nearly closed before it ever properly opened. The case of Arthur Warren Waite begins not in New York, but in Michigan, in the ordinary striving of a young man determined to become something more than he actually was. He was born in Grand Rapids on the 2nd of December, 1887, to a family of modest professional standing, and from an early age Arthur Waite showed a talent that would define and ultimately destroy him, the talent for appearing to be exactly what he wished people to believe he was. He took courses in dentistry. He spent time abroad, studying by his own account at the University of Glasgow. He came home calling himself Dr. Waite, and the title stuck, appearing in directories and on the lips of everyone who met him. even though the plain and later well-documented truth was that Arthur Waite was neither a fully registered physician nor a fully licensed dentist in any sense the law would have recognized as complete. He had built out of half-truths and genuine charm a professional identity sturdy enough to carry him into rooms that a man of his actual qualifications had no business entering. And it carried him, in 1915, into the acquaintance of Clara Louise Peck, the daughter of John Edward Peck of Grand Rapids. John Peck was no ordinary local businessman. Together with his brother, he had founded Peck Brothers Drug Company and had sold his interest in it for a sum running into the millions of dollars, a fortune he had gone on to multiply through directorships in banks and holdings in furniture manufacturing, the great Grand Rapids industry of the age. Clara was his daughter, and Arthur Waite, charming, credentialed in appearance, if not entirely in fact, courted her and married her on the 9th of September 1915. He had married into one of the wealthiest families in western Michigan, to the Pecks. It looked like their daughter had done very well for herself. To Arthur Waite, it looked like the beginning of a very different arithmetic entirely, one in which two elderly people stood between himself and a fortune, and in which he had already begun, quietly, to calculate how long he was prepared to wait. I want you to understand what kind of household Arthur and Clara Waite kept in New York, because the gap between its surface and its truth is the whole engine of this case. To the world, and increasingly to fashionable New York society, Dr. Waite was a rising figure, a man with a dental practice, a fine apartment, and a wife from an excellent family. He gave the impression, and cultivated it carefully, of a life lived just at the edge of the city's most glamorous circles. Underneath that impression sat a man already deeply and secretly involved with another woman, a cabaret singer named Margaret Horton, whom he saw regularly even as he played the attentive husband, and soon the attentive son-in-law. Waite wanted the Peck fortune. He wanted Margaret Horton. And he had concluded, with the same cold, analytical confidence he brought to everything else in his carefully constructed life, that the two elderly people who stood between him and both of those things could be removed the way an obstacle is removed in an experiment, methodically, and if the first method failed, by trying another. Consider the sheer arrogance folded into that double life, because it is easy to say a man had an affair and move on, and much harder to sit with what it actually required of him, night after night, for this particular man to carry it off. Arthur Waite came home from evenings with Margaret Horton and resumed, without visible strain, the character of the devoted husband and doting son-in-law, mixing Hannah's tonics with steady hands, ask after her comfort, playing every note of solicitous concern with an actor's precision. He was not a man overwhelmed by passion who stumbled into betrayal. He was a man running two entirely separate lives in parallel, each one requiring its own performance, and he managed both with a composure that unsettled everyone who later learned the truth of it. The same capacity that let him court a cabaret singer in secret, while playing the perfect son-in-law by day, is the same capacity that let him stand at Hannah Peck's bedside, measuring out poison with the calm hands of a caregiver. It was never really two separate skills. It was one skill, the skill of performing sincerity he did not feel, applied to both his marriage bed and his mother-in-law's sick bed with equal, chilling fluency. I want to say something plainly here, because it is easy in a case this strange to lose sight of who Hannah and John Peck actually were before any of this began. They were not obstacles. They were two people who had built a life together in Grand Rapids across 4 decades, who had raised a daughter, who had given generously to the causes and institutions of their city, who had, by every account, done nothing more than grow old and trust the man their daughter had married. Hannah, in particular, had come to New York not suspecting a single thing. A mother visiting her married daughter, expecting warmth and rest, and receiving instead a slow and deliberate poisoning delivered by the one man in the household, with the medical knowledge to make it look, for as long as possible, like nature taking its course. John Peck deserves the same plain accounting because the man reduced in most retellings of this case to a simple word, victim, spent the greater part of his life being something quite different, a builder. He and his brother Thomas had started Peck Brothers Drug Company from the ordinary beginnings of a Grand Rapids storefront and had grown it through decades of the unglamorous daily labor that actually produces a fortune, into a business substantial enough to sell for several $1 million. He sat on the boards of banks. He held stock in the furniture manufacturers that had made his city famous across the country. None of that had come to him by inheritance or accident. It had come from the same patient, methodical application of effort across a working lifetime that a man like Arthur Waite, standing at the other end of that fortune and wanting it without any of the decades that built it, could never quite bring himself to respect. John Peck had every reason to believe, in the winter of his life, that he had earned a peaceful old age, surrounded by a family that loved him. He had, in fact, married his daughter to the one person in the world actively counting down the days until he was gone. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. What Arthur Waite actually did to Hannah Peck belongs among the strangest true crime cases of the early 20th century, because he did not simply poison her in the conventional sense. He experimented on her. Waite had access, through his dental training and through connections in the medical world of the period, to cultures of dangerous bacteria, and he began introducing these into Hannah's food and medicine, diphtheria and influenza organisms among them, in the calculated hope of inducing a fatal infection that would present to any doctor as an unfortunate and entirely natural illness in an elderly woman. He was, in effect, trying to manufacture a plausible death using the tools of bacteriology rather than the tools of the poisoner's traditional trade. A chillingly modern method for a case unfolding in the earliest years of the century in which such science was becoming widely understood. Ask yourself why this particular method would have occurred to a man like Arthur Waite at exactly this moment in history. Because the timing was not incidental. The years just before the First World War were a period of genuine, almost giddy public excitement about the young science of bacteriology. Newspapers ran features on the germ theory of disease, as though it were a marvel of the age, which in a sense it was, the recent revelation that entire epidemics, entire mysterious wasting illnesses that had baffled physicians for centuries could be traced to organisms too small for the naked eye to see. It was a science full of promise and full of a certain intoxicating power for anyone with even a partial medical education, the sense that here, at last, was a hidden mechanism of life and death that an informed man could actually manipulate. Waite had exactly the partial, self-taught familiarity with that science to find it thrilling rather than sobering. He did not see disease as a force of nature to be respected. He saw it as a lever newly discovered that a clever enough hand might learn to pull. Hannah Peck sickened under his care. She weakened, and on the 30th of January 1916, in her daughter's own apartment, cared for to the very end by the son-in-law she trusted completely, Hannah Peck died. Pause, I want you to sit with this next part before I tell you what happened, because it may be the single coldest detail in the entire case, and once you have heard it, you will not be able to unhear it. With Hannah dead and the household deep in mourning, Arthur Waite did not so much as pause. He turned almost immediately to her husband, and he began the whole calculated process again on the very man who had just lost his wife of 4 decades, in the very apartment where she had just died, under the care of the very same devoted son-in-law. If that thought unsettles you the way it unsettles me, stay with this account, because the coldness only deepens from here. And I think this is exactly the kind of case worth sitting with all the way to its end, rather than looking away. John Peck came to New York in the aftermath of his wife's death, grieving and unsuspecting, and Arthur Waite set to work on him with the same experimental patience. He tried the germs again, working various cultures into Peck's food and, in one particularly audacious method, into a nasal spray he recommended his father-in-law use for his health. He tried calomel, a mercury compound, hoping to weaken the old man's constitution enough to finish the job by other means. None of it worked quickly enough. John Peck, whether through sturdier constitution or simple chance, kept surviving what should, by any of Waite's calculations, have killed him within days. And here we come to the detail that reveals, more than any other, exactly what kind of man Arthur Waite was underneath the charm and the manufactured credentials. When the germs proved too slow, he did not hesitate, and he did not reconsider. He simply changed his method, the way a scientist abandons a failed approach in favor of the next one on the list. He turned to arsenic, dosing his father-in-law's tea and his soup with an old and reliable poison that owed nothing to bacteriology and everything to simple, brutal chemistry. On the 12th of March 1916, John Edward Peck died in the same New York apartment where his wife had died 6 weeks before, and Arthur Waite, having now killed both of the people, standing between himself and a multi-million-dollar fortune, immediately arranged to have his father-in-law's body cremated, exactly as he had already arranged for Hannah, ensuring that whatever evidence remained in either body would be reduced within days to ash that could tell no one anything at all. It very nearly worked completely. Cremation in this era destroyed the evidence of poisoning left behind more thoroughly than almost any other method a killer could have chosen, and Waite had used it once already without a single question being raised. Had the second cremation gone forward on schedule, this case might never have existed at all. 2 elderly deaths in quick succession dismissed as an unhappy coincidence, a fortune quietly inherited, and a young dentist and his wife left to a life of wealth built on a foundation nobody would ever think to examine. What stopped it was not the police, and it was not any suspicion inside the Peck family itself, who had no reason yet to doubt the son-in-law they had welcomed so warmly. What stopped it was a telegram. A relative of the family, a woman named Elizabeth Hardwick, had seen something in New York that troubled her deeply. Arthur Waite, so soon after his father-in-law's death, out in the city in the company of another woman, behaving with none of the grief the household around him was still steeped in. She sent a telegram, signed only with initials, to Percy Peck, John and Hannah's son, and its message was as blunt as it was urgent. Suspicion aroused, demand autopsy. Percy understood immediately what was at stake and how little time there was to act, because he knew that within hours his father's body would arrive by train from New York, and that Arthur Waite intended to have it cremated exactly as he had done with his mother, erasing the last physical evidence of whatever had actually happened. Percy moved fast enough to intervene before the cremation could proceed, and he insisted on an examination of his father's remains. That examination found what Arthur Waite had been so certain would never be found. Traces of arsenic in John Peck's body and traces of chloroform besides. Physical proof that the official story of a natural death from illness could not possibly account for. The single detail Waite had never planned for. A suspicious relative's chance sighting on a New York street and a telegram sent in time had unraveled a scheme built with all the careful, patient calculation of a man who genuinely believed he had thought of everything. Arthur Waite was arrested on the 23rd of March, 1916, and once the evidence closed in around him, he did something that still strikes those who study this case as almost as strange as the murders themselves. He confessed, at length and in remarkable, unflinching detail, walking investigators through the germ cultures, the nasal spray, the calomel, the arsenic, describing his own methods with something close to the detached pride of a man who wanted credit for the ingenuity of his approach, even as that same approach condemned him to the electric chair. He spoke of his hatred for his in-laws with a coldness that shocked even hardened reporters, at one point reportedly telling investigators that he considered himself a member of a master class of intellect, entitled to remove those he judged inferior or inconvenient, a chilling piece of self-justification for a plot that had in the end been undone by nothing more sophisticated than a suspicious in-law and a well-timed telegram. Sit for a moment with the particular tone of that confession, because it is not the tone of a man unburdening a guilty conscience. Waite did not weep. He did not beg forgiveness from the daughter he had made a widow of both her parents within 6 weeks. He narrated. He walked detectives through his own reasoning, the way a lecturer walks students through a solved equation, correcting them when they misunderstood a detail of dosage, almost visibly frustrated that the germ cultures, his preferred and more elegant method, had failed to perform as the science should have predicted. It was, several who were present later said, less like hearing a murderer confess than like hearing a failed experimenter explain, with real irritation, exactly where his methodology had gone wrong. That is the detail about Arthur Waite that the passage of more than a century has never managed to soften. He was not sorry he had killed them. He seemed, if anything, faintly embarrassed that it had taken him so many attempts. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. On the 24th of May, 1917, Arthur Warren Waite was executed by electrocution at Sing Sing prison, going to his death still, by most accounts, more interested in the intellectual novelty of his own crime than in any genuine remorse for the two people who had trusted him completely and died for it. What does this case reveal about the world that produced it? It reveals how thin the membrane can be between a fortune built by one generation's genuine labor and a fortune claimed by the next generation's calculated patience. John Peck spent decades building Peck Brothers Drug Company into something worth millions, the ordinary long accumulation of a working professional life. Arthur Waite looked at that fortune and saw not a legacy to be respected, but a sum to be acquired, and he brought to the acquiring of it the exact scientific detachment that a more honorable man might have brought to an actual cure. This case sits at an uncomfortable hinge in the history of crime. The moment when a killer with a smattering of real medical training could begin to imagine murder not as an act of passion or desperation, but as a problem to be engineered, trial and error, method after method, until one of them worked. Waite believed his education elevated him above ordinary moral obligation, that intelligence itself was a kind of license. The court and the chair disagreed. There is also something to be said about the particular vulnerability of wealth in a case like this one, a vulnerability distinct from the kind we usually picture. We tend to imagine the rich as insulated, protected by lawyers and physicians, and the general deference the world extends to money. But that same deference is exactly what let Arthur Waite operate for months inside the Peck family's most private and defenseless moments. Nobody questioned a dentist tending his ailing mother-in-law. Nobody thought to ask why the son-in-law, rather than an independent physician, was the one measuring out the tonics and mixing the nasal sprays. His claimed credentials, however thin they actually were, bought him a species of trust that a stranger attempting the identical crime could never have obtained. Wealth did not protect the Pecks from Arthur Waite. It delivered him directly to their bedside and asked no questions of the man standing there with the medicine in his hand. There is a particular cruelty worth sitting with in how this case actually unfolded, because it was never the law that caught Arthur Waite through diligence or forensic brilliance. It was a family member's private unease at seeing a supposedly grieving man behaving like anything but a grieving man in public on an ordinary New York street within days of his father-in-law's death. The entire elaborate architecture of germs and calomel and arsenic and calculated cremation very nearly succeeded, and what brought it down in the end was the oldest and laced scientific instrument there is, a relative who simply knew that something looked wrong and refused to let the feeling pass unspoken. Here is the question I want to leave with you, and I would genuinely like to read your answer in the comments below. Arthur Waite treated the killing of two trusting, elderly people as an intellectual exercise, a puzzle in applied bacteriology to be solved through iteration, and he described it afterward with something disturbingly close to professional satisfaction. Is that coldness more or less troubling to you than an ordinary crime of rage or desperation? Does a murder planned with a scientist's patience, carried out over months, rather than in a single terrible moment, deserve to be remembered differently than the crimes that erupt in an instant and are regretted just as fast? I am not certain there is a comfortable answer. I only know that I think about the difference more than I would like to. The Riverside Drive apartment, where Hannah and John Peck each drew their last breath, still stands today, one address among thousands in a city that has long since forgotten the name Waite. Its windows lit most evenings by families who have no idea what was once measured out, drop by patient drop, behind them. The record remains, held in the trial transcripts and the confession he gave so freely. A document as strange for what it reveals about the killer's mind as for the crimes it describes. Her name was Hannah Peck, a mother of 61, who came to New York to be cared for, and was instead consumed by the very hand extended to help her. A woman who had spent 4 decades tending a household and a daughter, and had earned, by any fair measure, a peaceful old age she was never given the chance to reach. His name was John Edward Peck, a man who built a fortune across a lifetime of honest work and lost his life to a son-in-law who wanted that fortune without any of the decades it took to earn it. They died 6 weeks apart, in the same rooms, at the hands of the same man, and were saved from complete erasure only by a telegram sent just in time and a body pulled back from the crematorium's door with hours, not days, to spare. It is a narrow, almost accidental margin on which the entire truth of this case survived at all. Somewhere in that narrow margin, between the ash Arthur Waite intended and the evidence that survived instead, is the entire difference between a perfect, unremembered crime and the case that still unsettles anyone who reads it more than a century later. Think of it that way the next time's case crosses your mind. Not as the story of a brilliant poisoner finally caught by brilliant detective work, because that is not what happened here at all. It is the story of an ordinary act of love. A mother visiting her daughter, a father trusting his son-in-law, turned by one man's patient cruelty into the very mechanism of their deaths, and saved from total silence only by a woman on a New York street, who happened to notice that grief was being worn a little too lightly by a man who ought to have been drowning in it.